leads a project, Road4Schemes, an introduction to carbon farming schemes is the title of his presentation. Martin, you have 10 minutes for your presentation, and after we will have 10 minutes for discussion and questions, please.
Yes, and I hope you can see my screen now. And thanks a lot for inviting me for this extremely interesting and relevant seminar. It's so good to see that we can gather so many people around the topic of carbon farming. And I was also in the session this morning, and there was a lot of good discussions going into this afternoon session. So I look forward to this very much. But first of all, welcome to all of you. I'm Martin Thorsø from the Department of Agroecology at Aarhus University, and I will sort of briefly outline some of the discussions for this afternoon by talking about some of the challenges that are faced by different carbon farming schemes. And as Giovanni also mentioned, I'm coordinating one of the internal projects of the EJP SOIL program called Road4Schemes, where we look into specifically what are the opportunities for developing these carbon farming schemes, and how can we overcome some of these barriers that are when developing such schemes. But first of all, and also to frame the discussion, I'll just briefly recap some of the policy issues that are around carbon farming schemes and the whole context into which it's situated, because I think that's really important for this discussion. But first of all, yeah, the soil policy in the EU have lived quite a quiet life for a number of years, but in recent years this has changed a lot, especially since the development of the farm to fork strategy, where there was first of all a change in the perspective of policy making, an emphasis on developing result-based schemes, where farmers are rewarded and provided with incentives for delivering a particular result, as opposed to the traditional activity-based schemes that have been around for the past, and especially in the CAP. And then also in the soil strategy from last year, it was emphasized that there is this 55% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030 for all of EU. And in that goal, soil has gained a prominent position, not only the organic soils where there's most carbon, but also in the mineral soils where there's an opportunity for further sequestering carbon. And the general objective is that by 2030, there should be 310 megatons of CO2 equivalents sequestered in the land sector, and having climate neutrality by 2035. And as also outlined this morning, the Commission has initiated this initiative called Sustainable Carbon Cycling, where there's a range of different activities that support carbon farming. First of all, there's the development of a regulatory framework. An expert group has been proposed that will be in call this summer. And there's a range of different funding arrangements under the Horizon Europe program. For instance, the soil mission, where there's calls for scientific projects addressing these knowledge gaps in relation to carbon farming. With respect to carbon farming, a general definition as proposed by the Commission is that it's a green business model that rewards land managers for taking up improved land management practices, resulting in the increase of carbon sequestration in living biomass, dead organic matter, and soils, by enhancing carbon capture and or reducing the release of carbon into the atmosphere. And I think it's important to emphasize here that it's about developing a business model. So it's something that should be offered as a voluntary solution for land users, at least in this perspective. And it has a potential for sequestering carbon, but it's also somewhat uncertain. But at least it's been emphasized in these strategies that carbon farming should contribute with 42 megatons of land sinks by 2030. So it's something that there is big ambitions about advancing in the EU. And in terms of schemes, schemes is any form of voluntary agreement in which a farmer or a group of farmers commit themselves to applying carbon farming measures in return for a payment in various forms. And in the Road4Schemes project, we try to look into various kinds of schemes and how they work and how they are organized. And in Europe and beyond, there's a range of these schemes already in place. And we try to outline what is the content of these schemes and to harvest some of the experiences that they have encountered in their way of working with carbon farming. We can see, if we look at carbon farming schemes, there are different ways of organizing them. And this is a typology that was proposed to the Commission last year for 4 different types of carbon farming schemes that provide different relationships between land users and investors on the other hand. First of all, we have the traditional models where farmers are paid for a change in production practices from a funder, either a public funder or an NGO, very analogous to the schemes that we have seen under the Rural Development Program and also the schemes that will come under the forthcoming CAP plan from next year onwards. But an important goal of the strategy from the Commission is also to make it available for private funding to come in and finance some of these initiatives. And in that regard, working with corporate supply chains in financing these schemes is one option, where, for instance, you have an agri-food company that adds on a premium to their produce, and based on this premium, they provide a price for farmers so that they can implement some of these carbon farming practices. On the other hand, there is also the opportunity for an intermediate coming in and certifying the removal of these carbon by the implementation of different carbon farming practices by land users. And based on this certification, they sell credits to different kinds of buyers. And there's also the opportunity to do it in an exchange format where there's a certification body that certifies the activities that are taking place by farmers and how effective that is in removing carbon from the atmosphere. And they own the certificates, the farmers, and can sell it off to different kinds of companies. And we can see there's a range of different practices that are able to support and work with carbon farming. First of all, afforestation, agroforestry system, conversion of land use, management practices, and also this revetting of peatlands and introduction of paludiculture, the very effective measures that are in support and in discussion these years. In the Road4Scheme, we work with 3 different objectives. First of all, we try to assess the strengths and weaknesses of current schemes for carbon farming and additional ecosystem service payments, including opportunities for establishing effective monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. And I think from now on, we have conducted a scoping of the schemes that are available in Europe, and we have found around 200 schemes that are in use in Europe, both public and private, and we'll do a more in-depth analysis of 50 selected schemes. So that will be something we'll do over the summer, and we look very much forward to the results of this. And based on our analysis, we will present this to stakeholders and have a discussion regarding their perception of the different strategies for carbon farming and how we can design policy drivers that deliver effective result-based schemes for carbon farming and additional ecosystem service payments. And I think it's especially important to involve the stakeholders in this process because it's of course an important enabling condition that the farmers receive a payment, but there's a range of obstacles that need to be overcome. For instance, they need knowledge, and some of the actors around farmers, like foreign contractors or advisors, also need to be involved in this process because they provide an important support function for farmers. And then finally, we'll develop a roadmap in coordination with this framework that's coming out from the Commission on how to implement some of these initiatives in practice. And regarding opportunities, we can see that there is a growing market for carbon sequestration. There's an EU framework coming out. There's a range of co-benefits of carbon farming. And among stakeholders, there's a growing interest in sustainable land management and also in carbon sequestration. So it's something that a lot of stakeholders in and around farming are working towards. So in that regard, there are many opportunities for advancing this agenda in practice. There's also a range of challenges that needs to be addressed when developing these carbon farming schemes. First of all, it's important to ensure the fairness of initiatives. There's most opportunity for sequestering carbon in farming systems that are very depleted in carbon. So the farmers that have been working with carbon farming for years, maybe voluntarily, they have a bigger challenge in making ends meet and maybe more need support for preserving the carbon that's already there. The permanence of carbon farming is a challenge, and adding on to the already existing initiatives and providing an additional benefit is really important. And it's important to develop trustworthy and transparent schemes that are accepted by both land users, legislators, and investors. And at the same time, there's also the need for developing fast action, because we have some ambitious climate objectives. And I think in that regard, it's also important not to move too fast, because if we end up developing some institutions that don't work, or we need to change them afterwards, then it's very difficult to make these changes when they are established. So it's also important that we move fast, but get it right the first time, because it's difficult to make these changes subsequently. Then, that was not my intention. It's important to document the effects of these carbon farming schemes, and also document them in a cost-effective way. It's easy to develop a very complex system for monitoring, reporting, and verification, but it's also very costly. So it's important that the costs of monitoring is balanced with sort of the opportunities for gaining a price premium for the farmers. So there's also some funding left to support the actual activities that will take place on the field. It's important to bring in both public money and private investments, and also to make some institutions that facilitate this integration of public and private money. It's important to address some of the trade-offs and multifunctionality of carbon farming, and also to emphasize that these systems should deliver multiple ecosystem services, because we don't only need to focus on carbon sequestration, but there's a range of ambitions that we'll need to meet in the European policy agenda. There's a need to develop capacity, both in terms of research and in practice, and also, as we talked about this morning, avoid the double counting. And with respect to these challenges, each carbon farming scheme sort of have a different way of solving these schemes. And some of the initiatives that will present themselves later on in the afternoon will also sort of focus on how they have addressed some of these different challenges. And I think it will be very interesting to see how that has worked out in practice. But so far, this was my presentation, and I look very much forward to the discussion in the afternoon. So back to you, Giovanni.
Yes, thank you, Martin. And Tiziana, please.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the very interesting presentation. And so I will just forward to you one question that is in our question and answer session. What are your recommendations for the effective development of carbon farming in the framework of urban agriculture?
Well, I think urban agriculture is characterized by having a short value chain. So typically, when you have an urban context, there's consumers that are close by, and they are typically also somehow involved in the production system. So I think it's a really good opportunity for working with carbon farming, because there's also an opportunity for disseminating knowledge about carbon farming. So it's not only about sequestering carbon, it's also about disseminating carbon farming knowledge to the urban community. At least in the North European context, this is not really where we purchase most of our food, but but in terms of building capacity and knowledge, it's an important institution, and I think that would be my recommendations on how to do that. But of course, then there is the practical side of how you can do that and which type of measures you can work with. I'm a social and political scientist, so I wouldn't go much into detail with that aspect, but I suppose there will be other colleagues who can answer that better.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to ask you, in the context of the project that you are implementing, the Road4Schemes, you identify the various concerns for the implementation and monitoring, reporting and verification of the carbon farming. Have you seen that these concerns changes in the different geographical areas of the European territory?
We didn't do that analysis yet, but it's something that will take place over the winter. So we look very much forward to actually seeing whether there is geographical differences with respect to that. But maybe I'm not sure that there is a big geographical difference, but I think there is a difference across different types of investors and which type of proof they demand for investing in carbon farming. But that's only my hypothesis, so it will be relevant to see how that works out in practice.
Thank you very much, Martin. And let's see if we have another question for you. How did you choose the eco schemes that will be analyzed and assessed this summer? Will you include industrial solutions?
No, we're not working with industrial solutions, and I think if you're referring to the industrial solution as proposed by the Commission, we will have some schemes that also focus on biochar. But some of the other industrial schemes that are proposed, we are not working with.
Okay, so we need to go to the next speaker.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Martin, and I will leave the floor to Giovanni.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you also to